So Augustine, who is not one of my favorite people, although he may be somebody else's favorite person, he said that whoever thinks that they can or have described God has described or defined something that is completely different. So in spite of that, every year when Pentecost rolls around, I always personally feel obliged to try, maybe not to define God, but again, try to figure out what that entity it is, they are, I don't know. And every year I fail miserably. So Augustine was wrong about a lot of things, but he wasn't wrong about that. So some of the confusion about the divine came about as a result of Greek philosophy, which the early Christians used to define God, imperfectly, of course, although they would have never admitted it. And as with all expectations, less is always better. And those honored with the title of church fathers, they chose to use far more words that were necessary. And they used all these philosophical concepts that the people in the streets didn't understand. And they used all of that to come up with a definition of something that is essentially not definable. So from the very beginning, this definition led to all sorts of problems for people. To quite a few faithful early Christians, the three persons in one God looks suspiciously like polytheism. And people actually balked at the Trinitarian concept that was decided upon by the Council of Chalcedon 450 years after Jesus died. And these folks who disagreed, whose faith was every bit as deep as those we call the church fathers, they were labeled as heretics and they were actually persecuted. And they actually walked away. And the church that they formed, called the Church of the East, which is not the Orthodox Church, that church was bigger than the Orthodox and the Roman Church combined. Their head was at Babylon and they didn't know anything about Rome. So that group just split off and formed their own version of Christianity. And of course, another large group of people split off and became Muslims, because in Islam, there is a very clearly definable one God, a monotheistic God, again, that a lot of people couldn't understand. So what I have found doing my research for my book is that those we call heretics usually have a reason for their heresy. And while we might not agree with them, they had their reasons, which were compelling, obviously, at the time. So the fact is that throughout the centuries, most definitions and understandings about God sometimes bordered upon childishness. Since human beings really can't understand the divine, the power of the divine, they associate God with things that they know, like all-powerful white men who appear to rule the world. So well into the what century are we in? 21st century? I put 22nd here. Far too many Christians perceive God as an angry, bearded white man in the sky who must be referred to as he, even though the Hebrew scriptures, which form another basis for Christian theology, the Hebrew scriptures define God as both male and female, Shekinah or Ruah, that we understand as the Holy Spirit. Christians, of course, have tamed the power of that great Shekinah, rendering her a bird, a male one, of course. So like many things in life, poetry, including prayer, is helpful in just trying to understand the majesty of God. Poets and mystics seem to be the most in tune to appreciate the Spirit's channeling energy, and they often paint really beautiful pictures for us. And really, perhaps only poetry can describe the indescribable force of the divine that somehow came and comes and continues to wash all of us as we become more and more experienced with Jesus. So as a kid, I found the whole Catholic rote prayers, the act of faith, charity, morning offering. I found that really boring until I heard, "Come, Holy Ghost, fill the hearts of the faithful and enkindle in them the fire of thy love. Send forth thy love and they shall be created, and thou shalt renew the face of the earth." So I thought, now here's something bigger than a bird or Casper the friendly ghost or that fearsome Zeus guy up in the sky. But when you think about it, the titles for this divine entity are indeed spectacular. The Creator blessed, the fount of life, the fire of love, the seed of wisdom. Think of the image of Ruah moving over the waters of the deep in Genesis. Has anybody ever heard the poem The Hound of Heaven by Francis Thomas? Yeah. So the Hound of Heaven pursuing people over the years. And I think that quite a few of us sitting here or on Zoom have been beset by that very stunning being. So our reading today describes the Spirit as a noise like a strong wind coming from the sky, and then appeared as tongues of flames above the heads of those who were gathered. So is it any wonder that those people couldn't speak at first? They couldn't find the words to describe what happened to them and spoke gibberish, almost as if their speech circuits were disconnected. And once they did get their thoughts to align with their speech, the first thing they did was run out into the streets to tell everybody. But even then, their words seemed to make no sense. So perhaps the words of the poet Gerard Manley Hopkins might have helped them. So if you've ever read this poem, the world is charged with the grandeur of God. It will flame out like shook foil. It gathers to greatness. Or the words of the poet E.E. Cummings. I thank thee, God, for most this amazing day, for everything that is infinite and yes. And that is just the tip of the theological iceberg. So those who become acquainted with the Holy Spirit might define her as a disquieter and a great disturber of the status quo. Warm and cuddly, she is not. She doesn't come to solve problems. She comes to create them. She charges into our quiet places and says, enough of this already, get to work. She's an infinite designer and makes all things new, as the prayer says, in spite of our fondest wishes that they remain the same. And she is impatient. She wants things to change now and not in man-made notion of God's good time, because that time honors injustice and not divine. So I fear it would be a colorless, lifeless, boring, static world without the daily powerful intrusions of the Holy Spirit, the wild force of God's breath that goes from kingdom come and back again to sit right on your doorstep, demanding that you change your life, whether you're 16 or 65. Through the power of that Holy Spirit, you kind of get jobs that you might not necessarily want. If you continue reading in Corinthians after our reading today, you might get to be a prophet, a teacher, apostle. You might speak in tongues or become a healer. You feed the poor, you care for the sick and lonely, you visit the imprisoned, you comfort the mourners, you work for justice without pay, you give stuff away. You refuse to be in bondage to anything but God, and no higher up decides if you are worthy. And most of all, you don't care what anybody thinks about you. You are not afraid. Falling into her hands, the hands of that Spirit, is like a ride on a monster wave in Hawaii. It isn't fun, and it doesn't make for peace and quiet, but it sure is exciting. So listen again to the words of Francis Thomas and the Hound of Heaven. From those strong feet that followed after, but with unhurried chase and unperturbed pace, deliberate speed, majestic instancy, they beat and a voice more insistent than the feet. So that Spirit that pursues people, that Spirit will never be constrained. She will never be locked up or controlled, for she is the wildest and strongest force in the universe. She laughs wildly and uproariously at those who think that they know her divine mind. She throws open hearts and minds and totally changes you until you don't know who you are. Because the fire of her love is so dangerous, her titles were taken away from her and given to Mary, a human being whom men could control. However, it is the Shekinah, the Holy Spirit, and not Mary, who is the Queen of Heaven. It is Shekinah who is the mediatrix of all grace. It is Shekinah who is the throne of wisdom. It is she who shows the way. She who is the all-pervading spirit who renews the face of the earth. And so, even though you want to, don't run away from the fire of her love, even if she needs to drag you, kicking and screaming, away from the things you once thought were supposed to be. Let her keep using you until she uses you up. And guess what? You'll be reborn again and again and again. And best of all, she doesn't engage in age, gender, or caste discrimination. All of us are fair game for her creative energies. So the church regards Pentecost as the birthday of the church. E.E. Cummings regards every day as a new birth. And he wrote, "This is the birthday of life and love and wings. How should tasting, touching, hearing, sensing, breaking away, lifted from the no doubt unimaginable you?" So every day, in every age, every person is filled up to the top with that unending supply of grace and love. One of my favorite writers is Rabbi Waskow from the Shalom Center in Philadelphia. And he once met with a group of Christians to discuss the scroll called Perfect Thunder, Perfect Mind, which is in Hal Tausik's New Testament. And I think I might have used readings from it for our readings over the course of the years. And early Christians regarded this as part of their scriptures. Rabbi Waskow said that in that particular document, he heard the voice of Sinai, the voice which booms from the burning bush, not announcing I am who am, which implies the theologically static world, but rather I shall be what I shall be, which implies transformation and resurrection. And so the rabbi said in his email message, "Perhaps you will find her as holy and as awe-inspiring as I do. Do you hear her teaching on how to live, to commune, to think, to feel, to be silent in her presence? Do we? Have we?" So I'd like to end with the homily with the end of Hopkins' poems, God's Grandeur, which is one of my all-time favorite poems in the whole world. "And for all of this, nature is never spent. Oh, mourning at the brown brink eastward spring, because the Holy Spirit over bent world broods with warm breast and the bright wings. And so, Holy Spirit, come today with your bright wings of healing and hover over our broken, torn, and divided country so that you might renew us. Fill us with the fire of your love. Fix us, heal us, and make us what we are supposed to be, a people who honor God with our actions and not with our lips. We ask you, Holy Spirit, to give us those bright wings. Give us your fiery energy that we, with you, might renew the face of the earth. And we await your word." Humbly, I might add.